Hello, Miss Chartier. I'm Nathan, and I just want to first start off by saying I really enjoyed this book. As you can see, I bought it for myself, and I thought the storytelling was really good, and it brought me to a certain emotional state that I have not felt in a long time. And this book has kind of inspired me to start reading more. So, really good book, and I'm glad you made me. So the first question asks, um, which of the stories that Tim O'Brien tells is most likely not true, but is still a truth? And Tim O'Brien talks about this a lot in the book, how fiction or like falsehoods is sometimes more important to the truth than like concrete facts, because he wants, I think, to get us to a certain emotional state that you can't really get to unless he kind of fills in some of the details that might not necessarily be true, but is kind of how he feels in his head. And I think the story that is easily the best example for this is, sorry, I forgot the name. Something River, On the Rainy River. I remember reading this story in particular, and like I could just tell that this is not a like true account. Trying fleeing to Canada, finding a lodge on like a lake, and some like mysterious old man. Like I could tell it was fiction, but even reading the story myself, I could like feel myself there in that mental state of how he felt. Just, he's around my age. I'm 20 years old, and he just got drafted to go fight in Vietnam. And if that happened to me, I have no idea how I would react. Honestly, probably the same way he did. I would think about deserting, maybe, leaving my family, packing my bags, going for Canada. So in this story, Tim O'Brien just got drafted, and he's at a mental crossroads in this life. He doesn't particularly feel compelled by the war, as in the reasoning behind the war. He's not completely sold on. He actually, advocates against it, but just here and there a little bit. Um, so he doesn't want to go over and fight in a war he feels is unjust, but he also feels like the shame and the cowardness of deserting, and he doesn't want to do that either because he imagines all his friends and family back at home being ashamed of him, rightfully so. And he's at this mental crossroads in his head, and I think the use of the Tip Top Lodge, the river, Elroy, the old man, is kind of a vessel to explain his mental state at that time. I think Elroy specifically is kind of used as a mirror for him to like reflect off of, like almost specifically, because he's very reserved in the book. He doesn't talk much, doesn't say much. He's almost just like there. The Tim O'Brien doesn't even tell Elroy like why he's at the Tip Top Lodge. He says in the book that it's almost like he knows why he's there, but he never explicitly tells him, which I think makes it really clear that I mean that this story is false, and that how Elroy is just a mirror for the characters reflect on. And I want to say that specifically because Elroy is kind of the person who brings them to make that final decision. Makes he paddles out into the lake, and he comes within whatever 20 yards of the Canadian border, and he just sits there and starts fishing, and it kind of forces the main character to make a decision. Does Tim O'Brien, does he jump off the boat and make a break for Canada, or is he gonna stay in the boat and fight in the war? And that's the ultimate decision, and Elroy is kind of person who makes him make that decision. So I just want to read a quote to prove my last point of the book. It's on page 53. This wasn't a daydream. It was tangible and real. As we came in toward land, Elroy cut the engine, letting the boat fishtail slightly about 20 yards offshore. The old man didn't look at me or speak. Bending down, he opened up his tackle box and busied himself with a bobber and a piece of wire leader, humming to himself, his eyes down. It struck me then that he must have planned it. I'll never be certain, of course, but I think he meant to bring me up against the realities, to guide me across the river, and to take me to the edge, and to stand as a kind of visual, as I choose a life for myself. So, Elroy brings Tim O'Brien to the edge of Canada, and, you know, kind of just him being there kind of makes him make that decision. So, and just a little bit further down, I'm gonna read another quote. That close, 20 yards, and I could see the delicate lattice works of the leaves, the texture of the soil, the brown needles beneath the pines, the configurus and geology and human history. 20 yards, I could have done it. I could have jumped and started swimming for my life. Inside me, in my chest, I felt a terrible squeezing pressure. Even now, as I write this, I can still feel the tightness, and I want you to feel it. The wind coming off the river, the waves, the silence, the wooded frontier. You're at the bow of a boat on the rainy river. You're 21 years old. You're scared, and there's a hard squeezing pressure in your chest. What would you do? And exactly, what would I do? You know? And even though I know that this didn't particularly happen, the lake and the river and the boat, it having that kind of visualization in my head, like being able to make that decision into a physical decision, like jumping off the boat or not, into a physical decision, kind of elevates my ability to feel what Tim O'Brien was feeling. It kind of gives it a little vessel, the decision, like a vessel to kind of live in, so I can better, imagine what he's feeling. And that's why I think this story in particular is the best example for this question. Like, what is a story that isn't true but tells the truth? Because the truth in the story is not what actually happened, it's how Tim O'Brien is feeling, about just getting drafted. That is like the part of the story, like the meat and bones, right? And he wants us to get to that certain mental, feeling, that, like, so we can put ourselves in his shoes. And the only way to do that is to kind of create a story around this decision, so we feel the weight, all of the pressure that is bearing upon him at this moment. So Tim O'Brien goes on to describe how he can feel basically everyone watching him. He kind of sees like a light flash before his eyes. He kind of describes it as being like in a stadium full of fans, except those fans are all people that he knows, or even people he doesn't know, like Abraham Lincoln and like LBJ, but also like cheerleaders and his friends and his family, and all watching him make this decision. And what does he ultimately do? He stays in the boat. He doesn't desert to Canada. He decides to go fight in this war. And um, another point I want to make is that after he makes this decision, that's kind of the last we see of Elroy, which I think kind of proves my point that Elroy was only there to kind of entice Tim O'Brien to finally actually making a decision, because after he decides to stay in the boat, he's gone. Elroy's gone, and he doesn't ever see him again. Quote from the book: I don't remember saying goodbye. The last night we had dinner together, and I went to bed early. And in the morning, Elroy fixed breakfast for me. When I told him I'd be leaving, the old man nodded as if he already knew. He looked down at the table and smiled. At some point later in the morning, it's possible that we shook hands, I just don't remember. But I do know that by the time I'd finished packing, the old man had disappeared. So, Elroy was just there to help Tim O'Brien make a decision, and, well, Elroy isn't actually a real person, and Tim O'Brien used the character of Elroy to help us be in his shoes, and for us to help make the decision on our own, because he wants us to think about what would we do if we were him in that boat on that river, deciding if we were going to desert, or if we were going to go fight in the war. So, I think that is the real truth of this book, is how Tim O'Brien feels, and how even though this story is technically not true, it is truer than the real truth. I also want to say I really enjoyed this short story in particular. This one definitely stood out to me compared to all the rest. I mean, I enjoyed the whole book entirely, but this particular section I thought was really good.